Locals call it Devil's Promenade, a 4-mile road where the sky burns orange after midnight. Truckers say a floating light appears out of nowhere, and if it stops in front of you, you'll never drive that road again. This is the story of the Hornet Spook Light, a real phenomenon investigated for over a century and still completely unexplained. If you love true highway mysteries, tap subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Now let's roll into the dark. The story you're about to hear takes place in one of the most historically rich and mysteriously active regions of the American heartland, the Tri-State Corner, where Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma meet. A place marked by Native American displacement, mining disasters, and countless unexplained phenomena for well over a century. This is the territory where the legendary Route 66 passes through, that iconic mother road that connected Chicago to Los Angeles. But there's another road here, older, quieter, darker. Locals have called it Devil's Promenade since the late 1800s, and it's where one of America's oldest documented paranormal phenomena still burns night after night: the Hornet Spook Light. Marcus Wright was not the kind of person who believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena or anything that couldn't be explained by conventional science and common sense. He'd been driving trucks for 35 years, logging well over 3 million miles across every state in the continental United States. And in all that time, he'd heard hundreds of stories from other drivers about strange experiences on the road: phantom hitchhikers, UFO sightings, mysterious figures that appeared and disappeared, roads that seemed to loop back on themselves in impossible ways. Marcus had listened to all those stories with polite skepticism, always assuming there was a rational explanation that the storyteller had missed, always chalking it up to fatigue or optical illusions, or people's tendency to see patterns and meaning in random events. Marcus was a practical man, a problem solver, someone who dealt with mechanical issues and logistical challenges, someone who understood that the world operated according to predictable physical laws, and that everything strange had an explanation if you looked hard enough for it. He'd driven through every kind of weather condition, navigated through every kind of terrain, dealt with every kind of mechanical failure, and in all those years, in all those millions of miles, he'd never once experienced anything that made him question his fundamental understanding of how reality worked. That was about to change dramatically on the night of October 15th, 2024, when Marcus made a decision that would alter his perception of reality permanently. Marcus had been hauling agricultural equipment from Tulsa, Oklahoma, to Springfield, Missouri, a route he'd driven dozens of times over the years, a straightforward run that normally took about 3.5 hours if traffic was light and weather was cooperative. But on this particular October evening, Marcus had finished his delivery earlier than expected and found himself with several hours to kill before his next scheduled pickup. He was parked at a truck stop just outside of Miami, Oklahoma, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, scrolling through his phone and looking for something to occupy his time. That's when he came across an article about the Hornet Spook Light, one of those listicles about America's most mysterious places that pop up in your social media feeds. Marcus had driven through this region hundreds of times and had never heard of the phenomenon, which struck him as odd given how thoroughly it seemed to be documented. The article described the light as appearing regularly on a rural road called East 50 Street, also known locally as Devil's Promenade or Spook Light Road, located just a few miles from where Marcus was currently sitting. According to the article, the light had been appearing since 1881. It had been investigated by the United States Army Corps of Engineers in 1946, and it continued to appear regularly to this day, with the best viewing times being after dark on clear nights with no moon. Marcus found himself intrigued, despite his natural skepticism. Here was a phenomenon that had been occurring for over a century, that had been witnessed by thousands of people, that had been officially investigated by military personnel and yet remained unexplained. The practical, problem-solving part of Marcus's brain saw this as a challenge, an opportunity to apply rational observation to something that people claimed was mysterious and probably discover a perfectly mundane explanation that everyone else had somehow missed. Marcus finished his coffee, climbed back into his truck, and punched the coordinates into his GPS. The route took him north from Miami toward the Kansas border, through increasingly rural territory, past farms and fields that were already dark and quiet in the evening hours. The GPS directed him onto progressively smaller roads, from state highways to county roads to what were essentially gravel tracks cutting through farmland. Marcus noticed that the further he drove, the darker everything became. There were no streetlights out here, no houses with lights on, no other vehicles on the road. The darkness was absolute, the kind of profound blackness that only exists in truly rural areas far from any urban light pollution. After about 20 minutes of driving, the GPS indicated that he'd reached his destination, East 50th Street, also known as Devil's Promenade. Marcus pulled his truck over onto a wider shoulder area and killed the engine. The silence that followed was total. No traffic sounds, no ambient noise from civilization, just the ticking of his cooling engine and the faint whisper of wind moving through the fields on either side of the road. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab, his boots crunching on gravel, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet. The road ahead of him stretched into absolute darkness, a straight shot that seemed to extend forever into the night. According to the article he'd read, the light typically appeared somewhere along this 4-mile stretch, usually visible from the Oklahoma side looking west toward Kansas. Observers reported seeing it dance and move, sometimes approaching vehicles before retreating, sometimes splitting into multiple lights, sometimes changing colors from orange to white to red. The phenomenon was most active after midnight and seemed to prefer nights with clear skies and no moon, conditions that were perfect for tonight. Marcus climbed back into his truck, settled into the driver's seat, and prepared to wait. He'd brought a thermos of fresh coffee, his phone was fully charged, and he had a clear view of the road ahead through his windshield. The time was 10:45 p.m. According to most accounts, the light didn't typically appear until after midnight, so Marcus had at least an hour and a quarter to kill. He occupied himself by reading more about the phenomenon on his phone, diving deeper into the history and the various theories that had been proposed over the years. The Quapaw Indians, who'd inhabited this region before European settlement, had reported seeing mysterious lights in this area and considered the location to be spiritually significant, possibly the site of important tribal events or burial grounds. Early white settlers in the 1880s had reported seeing the light and had initially attributed it to lanterns carried by Native Americans who were supposedly searching for their ancestral lands after being forcibly removed during various displacement efforts in the 1830s and 40s. Another popular legend suggested the light was the lantern of a miner who'd been decapitated in a mining accident and was doomed to wander the area searching for his head. Yet another theory suggested it was the ghost of a farmer who'd been murdered on this road and whose spirit remained bound to the location seeking justice or revenge. Marcus found himself smiling at these folklore explanations, the kind of stories that people create when they encounter something they don't understand and need to give it narrative meaning. But what interested Marcus more than the legends were the actual documented investigations. The Army Corps of Engineers had spent considerable time examining the phenomenon in 1946 and had concluded that the light was genuine and inexplicable, ruling out conventional explanations like car headlights, electrical phenomena, or swamp gas. Various scientists and researchers had attempted to study it over the decades using different methodologies, and while some had proposed theories involving piezoelectric effects from geological stress or gases escaping from underground mineral deposits, none of these explanations had been definitively proven, and the light continued to behave in ways that didn't match any of the proposed natural explanations. Marcus checked his watch. 11:58 p.m. He'd been sitting in his truck for over an hour, and his eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness. The road ahead was visible as a slightly lighter ribbon cutting through the absolute black of the surrounding fields. The sky above was clear, filled with more stars than Marcus had seen in years, the Milky Way visible as a cloudy band stretching across the heavens. There was no moon, exactly the conditions that were supposed to be ideal for witnessing the light. Marcus felt a strange mix of anticipation and skepticism. Part of him genuinely wanted to see something, wanted to witness this phenomenon that had been documented for so long. Another part of him expected to sit here for a few hours, see nothing but darkness, and then drive away with his skepticism confirmed and a good story about wasting an evening chasing a legend. As the digital clock on his dashboard rolled over to 12:00 a.m., Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead with focused attention. And that's when, for the first time in his 57 years of life and 35 years of driving, Marcus Wright encountered something that his rational, practical mind could not explain. It started as nothing more than a faint glow in the distance, so subtle that Marcus initially thought it might be his eyes playing tricks on him, creating phantom lights in the darkness the way human vision sometimes does after staring into blackness for too long. But as he watched, the glow strengthened, became more defined, resolving into a distinct sphere of luminescence, hovering approximately 50 or 60 feet above the road surface, maybe a quarter-mile away. The color was difficult to describe precisely, predominantly orange, with hints of white and yellow, pulsing slightly, not like the steady beam of a flashlight or headlight, but with a quality that seemed almost organic, almost alive. Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate, despite his attempts to remain analytical. This was exactly what the accounts had described, exactly what hundreds of witnesses had reported seeing, and now he was seeing it with his own eyes. The light wasn't moving initially, just hovering there in the middle of the road, and Marcus found himself trying to apply rational explanations even as he watched it. Could it be a vehicle with unusual lighting? But there was no sound of an engine, no red taillights, nothing that suggested a conventional vehicle. Could it be some kind of drone? But the light was too large, too bright, and besides, what kind of drone operator would be out here in the middle of the night on this deserted road? Marcus grabbed his phone and tried to photograph the light, but the camera struggled to focus in the darkness, and when he reviewed the image, it showed only a vague blob of overexposed brightness against black. The light began to move. Not in a straight line, like a vehicle traveling along the road, but in a smooth, flowing motion that seemed to defy normal physics, gliding sideways off the road and then back onto it, rising higher into the air and then descending closer to the ground, all while maintaining its spherical shape and its pulsing organic quality of illumination. Marcus watched, transfixed, as the light performed movements that became increasingly complex and seemingly deliberate. It would rise vertically at a speed that no conventional aircraft could match, hang motionless at an elevated position for several seconds, then drop rapidly back toward the ground, only to arrest its descent just before reaching the surface and begin a lateral movement that traced intricate patterns in the air. The light seemed to be dancing, executing a choreographed routine that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Marcus found himself trying to detect any kind of structure around the light, the outline of a vehicle or craft, or anything that might explain what was producing the illumination. But there was nothing visible except the light itself, a self-contained sphere of glowing energy that moved with fluid grace through three-dimensional space. As Marcus continued watching, the light began to move closer, approaching his position with the same smooth, gliding motion. Marcus felt a sudden spike of anxiety. What if it came right up to his truck? What was he supposed to do? Should he start the engine and leave? But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, he found himself unable to move, held in place by a combination of fascination and something else, something he couldn't quite name, a feeling that he was witnessing something profoundly important, something that transcended his comfortable understanding of how the world operated. The light continued its approach, and Marcus could now see details that hadn't been visible from a distance. The sphere wasn't uniformly bright. It had darker patches that moved across its surface like shadows passing over the face of the sun, and there were occasionally flashes of different colors, brief bursts of red or blue or green that would appear and then disappear within the dominant orange glow. The movement patterns became more erratic as it got closer, as if the light was responding to his presence, aware that it was being observed. Marcus rolled down his window, and immediately he noticed something strange. There was no sound associated with the light, no engine noise, no electrical hum, no whooshing of air being displaced by movement, just complete silence, broken only by the ambient sounds of the night, the occasional chirp of insects and the distant call of a night bird. The light was now approximately 100 feet from his truck, and Marcus could feel his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The analytical part of his mind was still trying to categorize what he was seeing, still searching for a rational framework that could contain this experience. Ball lightning, perhaps. But ball lightning didn't behave this way, didn't maintain coherent form for this long, didn't move with such apparent intentionality. Some kind of plasma phenomenon related to geological activity, but that didn't explain the complex movement patterns or the way the light seemed to respond to his presence. Marcus made a decision that surprised him even as he was doing it. He reached over, grabbed his flashlight, and pointed it out the window toward the light. He switched it on and off 3 times, creating a simple signal pattern. For a long moment, nothing happened. The light continued its hovering, pulsing movement in the middle of the road. Then, unmistakably, the light responded. It brightened significantly 3 times in quick succession, matching Marcus's signal pattern exactly. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. That wasn't random. That was a response, a deliberate communication. The light was acknowledging his signal. With trembling hands, Marcus repeated the pattern, 5 flashes this time. The light responded with 5 distinct brightenings, perfectly matching his timing. Marcus sat back in his seat, his mind reeling. Whatever this thing was, it was intelligent. It was aware of him. It was capable of communication. All his comfortable skepticism, all his rational explanations, all his assumptions about what was possible and what wasn't, all of it was crumbling in the face of what he was actually experiencing. The light began to move again, this time coming even closer to his truck, approaching with what Marcus could only describe as curiosity, as if it wanted to examine him as much as he wanted to examine it. When it was within 30 feet of his truck, close enough that its glow illuminated the interior of his cab with orange light, Marcus could see that the sphere wasn't solid in any conventional sense. It seemed to be composed of swirling energy, like he was looking into a miniature sun, with complex patterns of movement and light playing across its surface in ways that suggested depth, suggested that there was much more to this phenomenon than just the visible light he was perceiving. Marcus was so focused on the light that he didn't notice the other vehicle approaching until its headlights illuminated his mirrors. He turned to see an old pickup truck pulling up behind him, and then another vehicle, a sedan this time, parking on the shoulder ahead of his truck. Within minutes, 4 other vehicles had arrived on the scene, their occupants getting out and standing on the road, all of them staring at the light that continued to hover and pulse in the darkness. Marcus climbed out of his cab and approached the nearest person, an older man in his late 60s wearing overalls and a worn baseball cap. The man nodded to Marcus and said, in a voice that carried the slow, measured cadence of rural Oklahoma, "First time seeing it?" Marcus nodded, and the man smiled. "Figured. You've got that look about you, that combination of excitement and confusion, and a little bit of fear. We've all had that look the first time. Name's Earl Peterson. I live about 5 miles from here, and I've been coming out to watch this thing for going on 40 years now." Marcus introduced himself, and Earl gestured toward the other spectators who'd gathered. "Most of us are locals," Earl explained. "We come out here a few times a month, whenever the conditions are right, whenever we need to remind ourselves that there's still mystery in the world, still things that science and rationality can't quite get their hands around." Marcus looked at the assembled group, a mix of ages and backgrounds, from young couples who looked like college students to elderly folks who moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age. They were all watching the light with expressions that ranged from wonder to reverence to something approaching religious devotion. A woman in her 50s approached Marcus and Earl, extending her hand. "Linda Kowalski," she said. "I teach physics at Pittsburgh State University in Kansas, about 30 miles north of here. Before you ask, yes, I'm a scientist, and yes, I've tried to explain this phenomenon using every tool and theory at my disposal, and no, I haven't succeeded." Linda gestured toward the light, which had now moved further away and was performing a complex series of movements that traced geometric patterns in the air. "I've been studying this light for 15 years, she continued. "I've brought equipment out here, spectrometers, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, everything I could get my hands on. The light shows up on instruments, so it's definitely real in a physical sense, not just an optical illusion. It emits electromagnetic radiation across multiple wavelengths. It seems to interact with the Earth's magnetic field. But here's the thing that doesn't make sense. The energy signature doesn't match anything we know. It's not combustion. It's not electrical discharge. It's not any form of plasma we've been able to identify. And the way it moves, the way it seems to respond to observers, that suggests some kind of intelligence, or at least a reactive component that we can't explain through conventional physics." Marcus listened to Linda's explanation, feeling both validated and more confused. Here was a trained physicist telling him that this phenomenon defied scientific explanation, and yet Marcus could see it right in front of him, performing movements and displaying characteristics that his own eyes and senses confirmed were real. As Marcus stood there with Earl and Linda, other members of the gathered crowd began sharing their experiences with the light. A young man named Tyler, who looked to be in his mid-20s, described how he'd first encountered the light when he was 17 and how it had changed his entire worldview, how he'd gone from being a hardcore materialist to accepting that reality was far stranger and more complex than he'd been taught to believe. An elderly couple, Frank and Martha Henderson, who'd been married for 53 years, talked about how they'd made watching the light a monthly ritual for their entire marriage, how they considered it one of their special shared experiences, something that reminded them that life contained mystery and wonder. A man named Carlos Rodriguez, who identified himself as a paranormal investigator from Texas, explained that he'd been documenting the light for 8 years as part of a broader study of unexplained phenomena in the American Southwest, and that the Hornet Spook light was, in his professional opinion, the most consistently active and well-documented paranormal phenomenon in the entire United States. Each story added another layer to Marcus's understanding of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a local curiosity or a minor mystery. This was something that had captured the attention and imagination of people from diverse backgrounds and belief systems, all united by their direct experience of something that shouldn't exist according to our standard models of reality. Earl, who seemed to have appointed himself as Marcus's informal guide to the phenomenon, began explaining the deeper history. "The thing you've got to understand," Earl said, "is that this area, this tri-state corner where Missouri and Kansas and Oklahoma all come together, this has been a spiritually significant location for a very long time, long before any white settlers arrived. The indigenous peoples who lived here considered this ground sacred, considered it a place where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was thin." Earl gestured to the surrounding darkness. "And then you've got all the tragedy that's happened here over the years. You've got the forced removal of Native American populations in the 1830s and 40s, entire communities displaced and destroyed. You've got mining disasters. Lead and zinc mining was big in this area, and there were cave-ins and floods and accidents that killed dozens of people. You've got the Civil War battles that were fought in this region, guerrilla warfare between Union and Confederate sympathizers that left hundreds dead. And then you've got all the personal tragedies, the murders and accidents and disappearances that have accumulated over 150 years of settlement." Earl paused, watching the light as it continued its dance in the distance. "Some people think all that death, all that suffering, all that spiritual significance, it's created something here, or maybe it's allowed something to come through, something from wherever spirits exist, if that's what this is. Other people think the light is more like a recording, an echo of past events that somehow got burned into the fabric of this place and keeps replaying. And then there's people like Linda here, who think it's something physical, but so far outside our current understanding of physics that we don't have the tools or concepts to properly explain it yet." As Marcus stood talking with Earl and the other observers, something about the light's behavior began to change. Instead of the smooth, flowing movements it had been executing, the light started moving in sharper, more angular patterns, as if its mood or intention had shifted. It began approaching the gathered group of observers more directly, moving closer than Marcus had seen it come before. Several people instinctively stepped backward, though Earl and Linda held their ground. "This is different," Linda said quietly, her scientist's eye detecting the change in behavior immediately. "I've seen it approach observers before, but not quite like this. The movement pattern is more aggressive, more purposeful." The light came within 20 feet of the group, close enough now that Marcus could feel a strange sensation emanating from it. Not heat, exactly, but something that made the air feel charged, like the atmospheric pressure before a thunderstorm, like the world was holding its breath waiting for something to happen. Marcus noticed that his skin was tingling, the fine hairs on his arms standing up as if responding to a static electrical charge. His mouth felt dry, his heart was racing. Every instinct was screaming at him to get back in his truck and leave, but he found himself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the pulsing sphere of light that had now positioned itself directly in front of the group. What happened next would be something Marcus would struggle to articulate for the rest of his life, because it wasn't a communication that happened through words or sounds or any conventional medium. Instead, as the light pulsed and brightened, Marcus felt something enter his mind. Not forcefully, not like an invasion, but more like information was being shared with him, like he was receiving a transmission that bypassed his ears and went directly into his consciousness. The sensation was accompanied by images, fleeting and impressionistic, but carrying enormous emotional weight. He saw landscapes that didn't look quite like Earth, or if they were Earth, they were from a time so distant that nothing looked familiar. He saw gatherings of beings that might have been human, but weren't quite, their forms slightly wrong, slightly translucent, as if they existed only partially in the physical dimension. He saw this location, this exact stretch of road, but viewed from above and across time, seeing it as it had been centuries ago when it was covered in forest, then seeing it cleared for settlement, then seeing tragedy after tragedy play out on this ground. Deaths and battles and accidents and sorrow accumulating like layers of paint until the weight of all that history had created something, had opened something, had marked this place as special or cursed or both. And underneath all those images was a feeling, a profound sense of loneliness and isolation, as if whatever consciousness was communicating through the light had been trapped here for a very long time, had been trying to make contact, trying to communicate, trying to be understood by beings like Marcus, who could see it and sense it, but couldn't fully comprehend what it was or what it wanted. Marcus staggered slightly, the intensity of the transmission overwhelming his senses, and he felt Earl's hand on his shoulder, steadying him. When Marcus looked at Earl's face, he saw that the older man had tears streaming down his cheeks. "You felt it too," Earl said, his voice rough with emotion, the message, the loneliness. Marcus nodded, unable to speak, and when he looked at the other observers, he saw similar expressions on their faces. Linda had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with wonder and something like grief. Tyler, the young man who'd spoken earlier, was sitting on the ground with his head in his hands. The elderly couple, Frank and Martha, were holding each other tightly. Whatever the light had communicated, it had reached all of them simultaneously, had connected them through a shared experience that transcended individual consciousness. Carlos, the paranormal investigator, was frantically making notes on his phone, trying to capture the details of what had just happened, while his hands shook with adrenaline or fear or both. "In 8 years of studying this phenomenon," Carlos said, his voice unsteady, "I have never, ever experienced anything like that. That was direct communication. That was consciousness reaching across whatever barrier exists between its reality and ours. That was..." He paused, struggling to find words adequate to the experience. "That was proof, absolute, undeniable proof that we're dealing with something intelligent here." The light began to withdraw, moving back toward its more typical position further down the road, and as it retreated, the intense pressure Marcus had felt in the air began to dissipate. The group of observers stood in silence for several minutes, each of them processing what they'd just experienced. Marcus felt fundamentally changed by the encounter, as if some barrier in his mind had been removed, as if he'd been forced to expand his conception of what was possible and real. Finally, Linda spoke, her scientist's mind already trying to analyze and categorize the experience, even as she acknowledged its profound strangeness. "That wasn't random," she said. "That was intentional communication. Something through that light wanted us to understand something, wanted us to feel what it feels. The question is, what do we do with that information? How do we interpret what we just experienced?" Earl, who'd been watching the light for 40 years, shook his head slowly. "I've seen a lot of strange behavior from that thing over the decades," he said, "but I've never felt anything like that before. That was different. That was like it dropped its guard for a moment, like it let us see what's really behind the phenomenon, whatever intelligence or consciousness is driving it." Marcus found his voice again, though it came out hoarse and strained. "What was that landscape we saw?" he asked. "Those images of places that weren't quite Earth or weren't quite our time, what was that showing us?" Carlos consulted his notes, his investigator's training helping him organize the chaotic experience into something more structured. "There are theories," he said, "theories that phenomena like this are actually glimpses into parallel dimensions or alternate timelines, places that exist alongside our reality, but separated by some kind of barrier that occasionally becomes permeable. What if the light isn't just a ghost or a spirit in the traditional sense? What if it's actually a window or a breach point, a place where another reality is bleeding through into ours?" Tyler, the young man, added his own interpretation. "Or what if it's the other way around? What if something from our reality, something from all the tragedy and death that's happened here, somehow punched through into another dimension and created this phenomenon as a side effect, like a wound in the fabric of space-time that hasn't healed?" The theories proliferated, each person adding their perspective, but Marcus noticed that despite their different interpretations, they all agreed on one fundamental point. They had experienced something that couldn't be explained by conventional science or rationality, something that demanded a complete reconsideration of how reality operated. As the hours progressed and moved past 2 a.m., some of the observers began to leave, citing work obligations or simple exhaustion, but Marcus found himself unable to consider departing. The light continued to perform its dance in the distance, sometimes approaching closer, sometimes retreating to the far end of the visible road, but always maintaining its presence, always there in the darkness like a patient sentinel or a persistent mystery waiting to be solved. Earl invited Marcus to sit with him on the tailgate of his pickup truck, and the two men watched the light in companionable silence for a while before Earl began sharing more of his personal history with the phenomenon. "I first saw it when I was 26 years old," Earl said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of memory. "That was 1979. I'd just gotten married to my first wife. Didn't work out, but that's another story. And we were driving through here late one night, taking the scenic route back from visiting her parents in Kansas. And there it was, right in the middle of the road, this ball of light that shouldn't have existed. We stopped, watched it for maybe 20 minutes, and I remember thinking that night that everything I'd been taught about how the world worked was incomplete, that there was a layer of reality that nobody had told me about, that I'd stumbled onto something that most people lived their entire lives without ever encountering." Earl paused, took a sip from a thermos of coffee he'd brought with him. "That encounter changed me, made me question everything. Made me start reading books about unexplained phenomena, about quantum physics, about consciousness and reality, and all these big philosophical questions I'd never considered before. And it brought me back here, again and again, trying to understand what I'd seen, trying to find answers that I'm still looking for 4 decades later." Marcus asked Earl if he'd ever regretted that first encounter, if he'd ever wished he could go back to his earlier, simpler understanding of reality. Earl considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there's a comfort in certainty, in believing you understand how things work. And once you've seen something like this, once you've experienced something that shouldn't be possible, you can never quite get that certainty back. Everything becomes questionable." Every supposedly solid fact has this little asterisk next to it in your mind that says, but what if there's more to it than that? It's a hard way to live, always being aware that you don't fully understand the world you're living in. He turned to look at Marcus directly. But would I give up the experience if I could? Would I choose ignorance over awareness? No. Absolutely not, because whatever this thing is, whatever's causing this phenomenon, it's real. It's part of the actual fabric of reality, even if it's a part that most people never encounter or acknowledge. And knowing that, seeing it with my own eyes, feeling it in my bones, that's precious. That's worth the uncertainty and the questions and the way it makes other people think you're a little bit crazy. Linda joined them on the tailgate, adding her perspective as someone trained in rigorous scientific methodology. The hardest part of studying this phenomenon, she said, is that it doesn't behave consistently enough for proper scientific investigation. It appears regularly, yes, but not on a predictable schedule. It moves and changes in ways that seem responsive to observers, which introduces a subjective element that makes controlled experimentation nearly impossible. And the instruments we have, they can detect it and measure some of its properties, but those measurements don't fit into any theoretical framework we currently possess. She gestured toward the light, which was currently performing a series of vertical oscillations, like it was bouncing on an invisible surface. From a physics perspective, the light shouldn't be able to move the way it moves. There's no visible means of propulsion, no exhaust or expelled mass that would explain the acceleration and direction changes we observe. The energy source is unknown. It glows continuously for hours without any apparent fuel or power supply. And the way it interacts with electromagnetic fields is bizarre, sometimes seeming to generate its own field, sometimes seeming to respond to external fields, but never in ways that match our models of how electromagnetic phenomena should behave. Marcus listened to these perspectives and found himself forming his own theories, his trucker's practical mind trying to find patterns and explanations even in the face of the inexplicable. What if, he said slowly, thinking through the idea as he spoke, what if this isn't one phenomenon, but multiple things happening at the same place? Like, what if there's a natural explanation for the base phenomenon, some kind of geological or atmospheric effect, but then all the history and tragedy here, all the spiritual significance that Earl mentioned, that's created a layer on top of it. So, you've got this natural occurrence that acts like a beacon or an amplifier for something else. Something more conscious or intentional? Linda nodded thoughtfully. That's actually not far from some of the composite theories that have been proposed. The idea that you could have a natural phenomenon that creates the physical manifestation we see, but that phenomenon becomes a conduit or an interface for something more complex. Like how a radio is just electronic components, but it can receive and transmit information that has meaning beyond just the physical waves. Earl added his own observation, and that would explain why the light seems to have different behaviors at different times. Sometimes it just floats and dances, pretty but not particularly interactive. Other times, like tonight, it seems to actively engage with observers, seems to communicate. Maybe we're seeing it in different states, or maybe different entities or consciousnesses are using it at different times. Indeed, as the conversation continued, Marcus began to understand that many of the people who regularly came to observe the light were dealing with their own struggles and questions about meaning and reality. Tyler, the young man, had been studying physics at university before his first encounter with the light had thrown his entire worldview into chaos, leading him to drop out and spend years trying to reconcile what he'd witnessed with what he'd been taught was possible. Martha Henderson, the elderly woman who came with her husband, revealed that they'd started coming to see the light after their daughter had died in a car accident 15 years earlier, finding some strange comfort in knowing that reality contained mysteries, that perhaps death wasn't as final as it appeared, that consciousness might exist in forms beyond the physical. Carlos, the paranormal investigator, admitted that his obsession with documenting unexplained phenomena had cost him his marriage and strained relationships with family members who thought he was wasting his life chasing impossibilities. Each person carried the weight of how this encounter had changed them, had marked them as different from the people around them who'd never experienced something so fundamentally challenging to conventional reality. Earl expressed something that resonated deeply with Marcus. The hardest part isn't seeing something impossible and not understanding it. The hardest part is trying to explain it to people who haven't seen it themselves. You tell people you've witnessed a genuine paranormal phenomenon. You tell them you've experienced something that science can't explain, and they look at you like you've lost your mind. They smile and nod and humor you, or they get concerned and suggest maybe you should talk to someone, see a professional. And you can't blame them, really, because if someone had told me about this before I saw it myself, I probably would have reacted the same way. But once you've crossed that threshold, once you know for certain that reality is stranger than the official story acknowledges, you're kind of alone with that knowledge. You're separated from the comfortable consensus reality that most people inhabit. Marcus felt the truth of those words settling into his chest. He'd been on this road for less than 4 hours, but he already understood that when he left here, when he went back to his regular routes and his regular life, he'd be carrying knowledge that would isolate him, that would make casual conversations about reality feel hollow and incomplete. As if sensing the emotional depth of the conversation happening among the observers, the light suddenly brightened, dramatically, increasing its luminosity to a degree Marcus hadn't seen before, casting long shadows across the road and illuminating the surrounding fields. Then it began to move in a new pattern, creating what looked unmistakably like geometric shapes in the air, circles, triangles, squares, executed with perfect precision. Linda grabbed her equipment bag and pulled out an electromagnetic field detector, pointing it toward the light. The device began emitting rapid beeping sounds, the needle on its analog display swinging wildly across its range. "The EM field just spiked massively," Linda said, her voice tight with excitement and scientific curiosity. "Whatever's happening right now, it's generating enormous electromagnetic activity, far beyond what I've measured from it before." Marcus watched as the light continued its geometric displays, and he found himself wondering if this was intentional communication, if whatever intelligence was behind the phenomenon was deliberately trying to demonstrate that it could create ordered mathematical patterns, that it possessed understanding of geometry and structure, that it was trying to communicate in a language that transcended verbal speech. Just as Marcus was trying to process the geometric patterns the light was creating, something unprecedented happened. The single sphere of light began to divide, splitting into 2 distinct orbs that moved independently of each other. Then those 2 split again, creating 4 separate lights, each maintaining the same orange-white glow, each moving with the same fluid grace. The 4 lights arranged themselves in a perfect square formation, maintaining exact distances from each other, and then began to rotate around a central point like they were connected by invisible spokes on a wheel. Earl stood up from the tailgate, his expression one of complete astonishment. "I have never, in 40 years, seen it split like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've read accounts from the 1800s that describe multiple lights, But in all my time watching, it's always been a single sphere. This is completely new." Linda was frantically adjusting her equipment, trying to capture readings from all 4 lights simultaneously. "Each one is generating its own distinct electromagnetic signature," she reported. "They're not illusions or reflections. These are 4 separate phenomena, each with measurable physical properties. But the coordination between them, the way they're maintaining formation, that suggests they're either being controlled by a single source or they're communicating with each other in real time with 0 latency." The 4 lights began to execute an elaborate choreography, weaving around each other in patterns that were beautiful and mathematically precise. They would converge toward the center point, coming within inches of touching, then explode outward to the corners of their square formation. They would swap positions, trading places in movement so fluid and perfectly timed that it looked rehearsed. They created spirals and helixes and 3-dimensional geometric forms that would have been impossible to achieve without sophisticated programming or, as seemed more likely given what Marcus was witnessing, some form of collective intelligence coordinating their movements. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the display, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. This was a demonstration, a performance, as if whatever was behind the phenomenon wanted to prove beyond any doubt that it possessed intelligence, coordination, and understanding of complex mathematical and spatial relationships. Tyler, watching beside Marcus, muttered almost to himself, "It's showing off. It knows we're watching. It knows we're trying to understand it. And it's demonstrating capabilities that force us to acknowledge its intelligence." Carlos was recording everything on his phone, though Marcus suspected that no video could fully capture the majesty and strangeness of what they were witnessing. "This is going to change everything," Carlos said, his voice shaking with the magnitude of what he was documenting. "This isn't just an unexplained light anymore. This is proof of intelligence, of coordination, of intention. This is first contact with something we don't understand, but that clearly understands us." As the 4 lights continued their display, Marcus felt something shifting in his consciousness, similar to what he'd experienced during the earlier communication, but more refined, more articulate. The message coming through wasn't in words, but in concepts and feelings that formed themselves into understanding without passing through language. The essence of what Marcus received was this: the phenomenon they were witnessing existed at the intersection of multiple realities, multiple dimensions of existence. The lights were manifestations of consciousness from a realm that existed parallel to the physical world, a realm where thought and energy were more fundamental than matter. The specific location of Devil's Promenade, due to a combination of geological factors, historical events, and what could only be described as spiritual resonance, had become a thin place, a location where the barrier between dimensions was permeable enough that consciousness from the other side could manifest in visible, physical form. The entities communicating through the lights weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They weren't the spirits of dead humans trapped and unable to move on. Instead, they were beings that had always existed in their dimension, beings that had been aware of humanity for far longer than humanity had been aware of them, beings that used these rare, thin places to observe and occasionally attempt communication with physical beings like Marcus and the other observers. Along with this understanding came a profound sense of the vast strangeness of reality, a glimpse into just how much existed beyond the narrow band of perception that humans typically experienced. Marcus felt simultaneously enlightened and terrified, elevated by the knowledge that consciousness extended far beyond the physical forms he'd always assumed were necessary for awareness, but also diminished by the realization of how small and limited human understanding truly was, in the face of a multidimensional reality that operated according to rules and principles that human science had barely begun to grasp. He looked at the other observers and could see similar expressions on their faces: wonder mixed with fear, excitement mixed with existential dread. This was knowledge that changed everything. Knowledge that once acquired could never be forgotten or ignored. Knowledge that separated those who possessed it from the comfortable certainty of those who didn't. Martha Henderson had tears streaming down her face, and when Marcus met her eyes, she said simply, "Our daughter. She's not gone. She's just in a place we can't normally see, but she's there, she's conscious, she still exists." The light had given her the gift of certainty about something she desperately wanted to believe, but had never been sure of, and Marcus could see both the joy and the pain of that certainty written on her features. The four lights, having completed their elaborate display, began to converge back toward the center point where they'd originally split. They drew closer and closer, their individual glows beginning to merge and overlap, until with a flash of brilliant white light that caused all the observers to shield their eyes momentarily, they coalesced back into a single sphere. The unified light pulsed once, twice, 3 times, a pattern that felt like farewell or acknowledgement, and then began to retreat down the road, moving away from the gathered observers, heading west toward the Kansas border. Marcus watched it go, feeling an unexpected sense of loss, as if something precious was being withdrawn, as if a door that had been briefly opened was now closing. The light continued its retreat until it was once again just a distant glow on the horizon, resuming the more typical behavior that characterized most observations of the phenomenon. Earl let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding. "Well," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I guess I needed to keep coming back all these years, because I was waiting for that. That was what I've been hoping to see, hoping to understand. And now I have, and I honestly don't know if I feel better or worse for it." The small group of observers stood in silence for several minutes, each person processing what they'd witnessed in their own way. Linda was reviewing her equipment readings, shaking her head in disbelief at the data she was seeing. The electromagnetic spikes during the splitting and merging events were off the charts, she said. "I'm going to need to have my equipment calibrated because these readings are so far outside normal parameters that I'm having trouble believing they're accurate." "But if they are accurate, if the light really generated the kind of energy my instruments are showing, then we witness something that rewrites our understanding of what's possible in terms of energy generation and manifestation." Tyler was sitting on the ground again, his face buried in his hands, and when he looked up, Marcus could see that the young man's entire worldview had just been shattered and reconstructed in the space of a few hours. "I can't go back to my old life after this," Tyler said. "I can't pretend that reality is what they teach in textbooks. I can't accept the limitations of conventional science when I've just seen something that proves those limitations are arbitrary, are just based on lack of awareness rather than actual boundaries of what's possible." Carlos was still recording, still documenting, his investigator's instincts overriding his emotional response. "This is the most significant paranormal documentation of my career," he said. "This is evidence that will force serious researchers to reconsider their assumptions about the nature of consciousness and reality. This is..." He paused, searching for adequate words. "This is proof." Marcus checked his watch and was shocked to discover that it was 4:30 in the morning. He'd been on Devil's Promenade for nearly 6 hours, and the time had passed in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. The sky to the east was beginning to show the first subtle lightening that preceded dawn, the absolute blackness giving way to the deep blue of approaching morning. The light in the distance seemed to sense the changing conditions, and Marcus noticed that its glow was becoming less distinct, harder to see against the gradually lightening sky. Earl noticed Marcus checking the time and nodded knowingly. "It usually disappears around dawn," he explained. "As soon as there's enough natural light in the sky, the phenomenon fades out. Nobody knows if that's because it actually ceases to exist in daylight or if it's just impossible to see against the brighter background. But either way, once the sun comes up, the show's over until the next dark night." Marcus felt a pang of regret that his experience with the light was coming to an end, even as he recognized that he desperately needed sleep and probably shouldn't be driving in his current mentally and emotionally exhausted state. As the gathered observers began preparing to leave, returning to their vehicles and their regular lives, Marcus found himself exchanging contact information with several of them. Linda gave him her university email address and made him promise to reach out if he wanted to discuss what he'd witnessed, if he needed to talk to someone who would understand. Earl wrote down his phone number on a scrap of paper and told Marcus that he was always available if Marcus needed someone to listen, someone who understood what it was like to carry the knowledge of something impossible. Tyler, still looking shaken but also somehow more centered than he'd appeared earlier in the night, thanked Marcus for being there, for sharing the experience, for being another witness to something that would otherwise feel like a hallucination or a dream. Carlos handed Marcus a business card with his paranormal investigation company's information and asked if Marcus would be willing to be interviewed on the record about his experience, to add his testimony to the growing documentation of the Hornet Spook light phenomenon. Martha Henderson, the elderly woman who'd found comfort in the message about her daughter, hugged Marcus tightly and whispered, "Thank you for being here." Somehow it means more when there are witnesses, when you're not alone in experiencing something this profound. One by one, the other observers departed, their taillights disappearing down the dark road until finally only Marcus and Earl remained, standing together in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the light's final movements before daybreak rendered it invisible. Earl and Marcus sat in silence for a while before Earl spoke again. "You're changed now," he said simply. "You know that, right? You can't unknow what you've learned tonight. You can't unsee what you've witnessed. For the rest of your life, you'll carry the certainty that reality is far stranger and more complex than most people believe, and that knowledge will set you apart. It's a lonely thing sometimes, but it's also precious. You've been given a gift, whether it feels like one right now or not." Marcus nodded slowly. "What do I do with it?" he asked. "How do I go back to my regular life, driving my routes, making deliveries, having normal conversations with people, when I know that all of that is just the surface of something much deeper and stranger?" Earl smiled, a warm expression that carried decades of experience with exactly that question. "You live your life," he said. "You do your job, you maintain your relationships, you participate in the everyday world. But you do it with the awareness that there are layers underneath, that the mystery is always there, even when you're not directly confronting it. And when it gets hard, when the knowledge feels like a burden, you come back here. You come back to places like this, thin places where the boundaries are permeable, and you remind yourself why the burden is worth carrying. Because knowing the truth, even when the truth is strange and unsettling, is always better than living in comfortable ignorance. As the two men watched, the light executed one final series of movements. a graceful spiral that rose high into the air before descending back toward the ground. And then, as the eastern sky continued to brighten with the approaching dawn, the light simply faded out, diminishing in brightness over the course of perhaps 30 seconds until it was completely gone, leaving nothing but the empty road and the awakening landscape. Marcus felt the loss of its presence like a physical ache, like saying goodbye to someone important that you might never see again. Earl stood up from where he'd been sitting on his truck's tailgate and stretched, his joints audibly cracking after hours of sitting in the cool night air. "That's it until tomorrow night," he said, "or the night after, or whenever the conditions are right again and it decides to appear. The thing about the light is that it's always on its own schedule, always operating according to rules we don't fully understand. You can come out here 100 nights in a row and see nothing, or you can come once and witness what you witnessed tonight. There's no predicting it, no controlling it. It does what it does when it wants to do it." Marcus walked back to his truck, his legs stiff from standing and sitting for so many hours, his mind still spinning with everything he'd experienced and learned. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, which seemed almost shockingly loud after hours of relative silence, and began the drive back toward the main highway. As he navigated the small gravel roads that would take him away from Devil's Promenade, Marcus caught one last glimpse of the location in his rearview mirror, the road now visible in the growing dawn light, looking completely ordinary and unremarkable, giving no indication whatsoever of the profound mysteries that manifested there after dark. He thought about all the legends and stories he'd heard over his 35 years of driving, all the accounts he'd dismissed as superstition or imagination, and now he found himself wondering how many of them might have been accurate descriptions of genuine phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of what conventional science acknowledged as possible. As Marcus drove, watching the sun finally break above the horizon and flood the landscape with golden morning light, he grappled with the question Earl had raised. How was he supposed to integrate what he'd learned into his regular life? He had a delivery to make in Springfield in a few hours. He had routes to drive, schedules to maintain, a profession to uphold. But how was he supposed to focus on the mundane logistics of trucking when he now carried the certainty that consciousness existed in forms beyond the physical? That reality contained dimensions humans couldn't normally perceive, that entities from other realms could manifest in the physical world under the right conditions. Marcus pulled into a truck stop as the morning traffic began to build on the highways, poured himself a cup of coffee from the convenience store, and sat in his cab trying to organize his thoughts. He pulled out his phone and began typing notes about the experience, trying to capture the details before they faded or became confused in memory. He wanted to remember exactly what he'd seen, exactly what he'd felt during those moments of communication with the lights, exactly what understanding had been conveyed to him about the nature of reality and consciousness. But he found that words were inadequate to the experience, that trying to describe it was like trying to capture the ocean in a bucket. You might get some of the water, but you'd lost the vastness, the depth, the essential quality that made it what it was. In the days and weeks that followed his night on Devil's Promenade, Marcus found himself struggling with exactly the isolation that Earl had warned him about. When he tried to tell other truckers about his experience at a rest stop in Missouri, he saw the familiar expressions appear on their faces, the polite skepticism, the concern that maybe Marcus had been on the road too long, the subtle distancing that people do when they encounter something that challenges their comfortable worldview. After a few such attempts, Marcus stopped trying to share the experience with people who hadn't been there, who hadn't seen what he'd seen. Instead, he found himself exchanging emails with Linda, the physicist from Pittsburgh State, comparing notes about the experience and discussing the theoretical frameworks that might accommodate what they'd witnessed. He talked on the phone with Earl several times, finding comfort in conversations with someone who understood the peculiar burden of carrying impossible knowledge. He even agreed to be interviewed by Carlos for his paranormal research documentation, spending 2 hours on a video call describing in detail everything he'd witnessed and felt that night. Linda sent Marcus a copy of a paper she'd submitted to a peer-reviewed physics journal, documenting her instrumental readings from the night Marcus had been present and attempting to propose theoretical explanations for the phenomenon based on cutting-edge theories about dimensional physics and consciousness studies. The paper was rejected by 3 different journals before finally being accepted by a more open-minded publication that specialized in anomalous phenomena. Linda sent Marcus the rejection letters, and he was struck by how hostile some of them were, how the reviewers dismissed her meticulous data collection and rigorous methodology simply because the subject matter challenged their preconceptions about what was possible. This is what happens when you try to do real science on phenomena that don't fit the accepted paradigm, Linda wrote in an email accompanying the rejection letters. The scientific establishment claims to value evidence and observation above all else, but when the evidence points towards something that contradicts their fundamental assumptions, they reject the evidence rather than questioning the assumptions. It's frustrating, but it's also understandable. Accepting what we witnessed that night requires rebuilding entire theoretical frameworks, and most scientists aren't willing to do that level of fundamental reconceptualization. Marcus noticed changes in himself that went beyond just his intellectual understanding of reality. He found himself more sensitive to atmospheric conditions, more aware of subtle shifts in the environment that he'd previously ignored or not consciously noticed. He developed what he could only describe as an intuition about places, a sense of whether a location felt spiritually neutral or whether it carried some kind of significance or charge. He started having vivid dreams that felt less like normal sleep experiences and more like actual visits to other places or dimensions. Dreams where he communicated with entities that didn't have physical forms. Dreams that left him waking with knowledge or understanding that he hadn't possessed before falling asleep. These changes were subtle enough that Marcus didn't think anyone who didn't know him very well would notice, but he felt them profoundly, felt himself becoming something slightly different from who he'd been before that night on Devil's Promenade. Tyler, the young man who'd been so affected by the experience, sent Marcus a message several months after that night, explaining that he'd decided to dedicate his life to studying consciousness and anomalous phenomena, that he was enrolling in a graduate program that focused on consciousness studies and parapsychology, that the experience had given him a sense of purpose and direction he'd been lacking before. 6 months after his first experience, Marcus found himself back in the Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri tri-state area, and he made the decision to return to Devil's Promenade. This time he went alone, without the group of regular observers, arriving at the location around 11 p.m. on a moonless night with clear skies. He parked in the same spot he'd used on his first visit, shut off his engine, and waited. The light appeared around midnight, just as it had before, a glowing sphere dancing and moving in the darkness. But this time, Marcus felt a sense of recognition, almost like he was encountering an old friend rather than a mysterious phenomenon. The light seemed to recognize him too, approaching his truck more directly than it had on that first night, coming close enough that its glow illuminated the interior of his cab. Marcus sat watching it, and again he felt that sense of communication, that wordless transmission of understanding and acknowledgement. The message he received this time was simpler, more direct. He was one of the witnesses now, one of the people who carried knowledge of the truth, one of the nodes in a network of awareness that existed parallel to the consensus reality that most humans inhabited. The light was always here, the message conveyed, always present in this thin place where dimensions touched, always available for those who knew where to look and who were willing to see, always ready to communicate with consciousness that was open to receiving communication. Marcus sat with the light for several hours, not trying to analyze or explain or document, just experiencing the presence of something that existed outside the normal boundaries of physical reality, something that reminded him that the universe was far stranger, far more wondrous, and far more mysterious than the everyday world acknowledged. As Marcus drove away from Devil's Promenade for the second time, as the sun rose and the light faded once again with the coming of daylight, he found himself thinking about all the questions that remained unanswered despite everything he'd experienced. He still didn't know exactly what the light was, whether it was a natural phenomenon that consciousness used as a vehicle for manifestation, or whether it was itself composed of consciousness in some fundamental way. He didn't know why this specific location, this particular 4-mile stretch of rural road, had become such a powerful thin place where the boundaries between dimensions were permeable. He didn't know whether the entities that communicated through the light were the spirits of deceased humans or non-human intelligences that had always existed in their dimension, or something else entirely that didn't fit into any category that human language possessed words for. He didn't know why some people like Earl and Linda and the others who regularly gathered to witness the phenomenon seemed to be more sensitive to it, more able to receive the communications it offered, while others could look at the light and see nothing but an unexplained curiosity with no deeper significance. All these questions remained, as mysterious after his experiences as they'd been before, and Marcus realized that perhaps the questions were the point, that the mystery itself was the message, that what the light was teaching those who witnessed it was that reality was far more complex and strange than human understanding could fully encompass, and that accepting that limitation, accepting the existence of permanent mystery, was a form of wisdom in itself. Marcus Wright continued his career as a trucker, continuing to drive the same routes, make the same deliveries, maintain the same professional relationships he'd always had. To outside observers, nothing about him had changed. But Marcus knew that he was fundamentally different from the person he'd been before that October night when he'd first encountered the Hornet Spook light on Devil's Promenade. He now lived in two worlds simultaneously: the everyday physical world of logistics and schedules and mechanical systems, and a larger reality that contained dimensions and consciousness and mysteries that most people never encountered or acknowledged. He carried knowledge that isolated him, but also connected him to a scattered community of witnesses and experiencers who understood what he'd seen and felt. He'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain of consensus reality, and that glimpse had changed him permanently in ways both burdensome and precious. And here's where this story leaves you, the listener, with the same choice that Marcus faced after reading that article in a truck stop 6 months ago. The Hornet Spook light is real. It's documented. It appears regularly on that 4-mile stretch of road called Devil's Promenade in the tri-state corner where Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma meet. You can drive there yourself. You can park on that dark road on a moonless night and wait to see if the light appears. You can stand in that thin place where dimensions touch and see if you're one of the people who's sensitive enough, open enough to receive the communication that the phenomenon offers. But understand this before you make that choice. If you see it, if you experience it, If you receive the message that it transmits to those who are ready to receive it, you'll be changed by that experience. You'll carry knowledge that will separate you from the comfortable consensus reality that most people inhabit. You'll understand that the world is stranger, more mysterious, and more wondrous than the everyday appearance suggests, and that understanding can't be unknown once it's acquired. Some people seek that knowledge desperately, feeling that truth, no matter how strange, is always preferable to comfortable ignorance. Other people prefer to stay within the boundaries of conventional understanding, feeling that some mysteries are better left unexplored. Neither choice is wrong. They're just different paths through the same strange landscape of human existence. The Hornet Spook light still burns above Devil's Promenade, real, documented, and waiting for whoever's brave enough to see it. Subscribe for more true road legends and share this with a friend who drives at night, alone.